So suppose you're driving along and there's a guy by the side of the road who's bleeding, and you pull over and he says, "Please help me. I had an accident while I was hiking. I've lost a lot of blood. I'm afraid that if I don't get to a hospital soon, I'm going to lose my leg." And he says, "But there's a hospital down the road. Could you take me there?" And you think for a second, you say, "Well, I really would like to help this guy, but I just had new leather upholstery put in my car, and he's going to bleed all over the place. It'll ruin it completely. Maybe I'll let him go. Maybe someone else will pick him up." How many of you would say, raise your hand, that you would be morally monstrous to let this person bleed by the side of the road because you're thinking about your leather seats? I see most of your hands going up. Let's consider a different case. You're home one day when the mail arrives, and you get a letter from an organization like Oxfam or UNICEF, and it says, "There are people on the other side of the world who are desperately in need of food and medicine. And guess what? You have the power to help these people. You can save these people's lives. All you need to do is make a relatively modest donation, a small portion of your annual income." And you say to yourself, "Well, I'd like to help these people, but I was thinking of putting some new leather upholstery in my car. So I'm going to save the money for that instead of using the money to save these people." Now, how many of you think that you're a moral monster if you do that? I see maybe a couple of reluctant hands going up, but not very many. So a little over 30 years ago, the philosopher Peter Singer posed a dilemma like this to the affluent world. He said, "Why is this so different from this? Why is it that we feel that we have a strong moral obligation to help that person who's bleeding by the side of the road, but not people on the other side of the world whose lives we can save or dramatically improve by making relatively modest sacrifices?" Hold that thought, and let's talk about photography. Amateur photography in particular. So this is the camera that I got for my birthday a few years ago. It's a nice camera, and it's good for an amateur like me because it has these nice little automatic settings. Here's your landscape mode, here's your portrait mode, and what's great about these settings is that they're point and shoot. You just put it in landscape mode, and it configures the f-stop and everything you need to take a decent picture of a mountain in broad daylight from far away, or a person who's up close in ordinary indoor lighting from about 3 or 4 feet away. Very useful. Now, occasionally I get ambitious and I want to try something funky, someone up close, off to the side, and out of focus in very low light or something like that. And if I'm going to do that, then I would put the camera in manual mode. And when I put the camera in manual mode, I can adjust all of the settings myself and do exactly what I need in order to respond to the demands of my artistic ambitions. What's nice about this kind of design, having the automatic settings and having manual mode, is that they allow an amateur photographer like me, or even a professional photographer, to navigate the ubiquitous trade-off between efficiency and flexibility. The automatic settings are wonderfully efficient, point and shoot, and most of the time they get you the right answer. On the other hand, but they're not very flexible. You know, if you're trying to do something fancy, you can't use the point and shoot settings. At the same time, the manual mode is maximally flexible. You can do anything you want, but it's not very efficient. It takes time, and if you don't know what you're doing, or even if you do know what you're doing, you're likely to make a mistake. But the nice thing about having both modes is that you can toggle back and forth. If you're in a standard kind of photographic situation, then you can use one of your automatic settings, and you can use manual mode when you want to do something fancy. Well, it turns out that the human brain has the same basic kind of design, as demonstrated in the situations where people are choosing between an immediate reward and a delayed reward. So if you put someone in a brain scanner and say, "How would you like to have $2 right now?" you'll see increased activity in these brain regions called the ventral striatum and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which are essentially saying, $2 now, gimme, gimme, gimme. A reward that I like, whether it's food or sex or money or whatever it is, that's good. Let's have some of that right now. Now, that's not always the best thing to do. Sometimes we're better off not using the automatic settings and instead putting ourselves in manual mode. Perhaps you can have $4 if you're willing to wait a week. And when people are willing to wait that extra time for the larger reward, you see increased activity in a part of the brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is essentially the seat of what we call cognitive control, the ability to take the path of greater resistance. So just like the camera, we can go with the automatic setting that gets the answer right most of the time, or we can use our manual mode to take the path of greater resistance when the situation calls for it. Now, morality. You can't get out of Harvard without hearing about dilemmas in which people get run over by trolleys, and here's your initiation if you haven't heard this before. The trolley is headed down the tracks towards these 5 people, and you can hit this switch so that the trolley will go away from the 5 and onto the 1. And most people say that that's okay. Next case. The trolley is headed towards these 5 people, and this time the only way you can save them is to push this large guy off of the footbridge so that he'll land on the tracks, and you can use him as a kind of trolley stopper to save the 5. We'll assume you can't jump yourself, this will definitely work, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, most people say that that's not okay. Now, this is an interesting pair of moral dilemmas. There's a question about why should we say that it's okay to push or to trade 1 life for 5 in the first case, but not in the second case. I want to focus on the psychological and neuroscientific question: why does this actually happen? Why do we say that it's okay in the first case, but not here? And the theory goes like this, and the theory is based on the same principle as the camera. So we get the switch case. You've got your manual mode that says 5 lives for 1. That sounds pretty good. And in the switch case, there's not much of an emotional response to the thought of running this guy over for whatever reason. And so we say, okay, that's all right. You get the footbridge case. Manual mode says 5 lives for 1. That sounds like a pretty good deal. But our automatic settings react to this case in a different way. And that automatic response tends to dominate. And as a result, most people, not everybody, economists sometimes say that it's okay to do this here, but most people will say that that's not okay. Now, can we test this theory? Indeed, we can. There's a famous neurological patient named Phineas Gage, and the short story is that he was working on the railroad one day and he got this iron spike through his head, and as a result, he went from being this upstanding man of great character to being a kind of lawless wanderer. The interesting thing about Gage is that his intellectual faculties seemed to remain intact. In other words, his manual mode was just fine, but his emotional responses to things and his ability to make decisions were dramatically impaired. So what would happen if we give these trolley dilemmas to people like Phineas Gage? Well, it turns out there are patients like him who have damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, one of those brain regions that's involved in saying, gimme, gimme now, when there's an immediate reward available. And so the story looks like this again. Manual mode says, hey, let's go with the numbers, let's make the utilitarian response. Your automatic settings, one of them at least says, no, that doesn't sound good. If we get rid of the automatic settings by driving a spike through it or whatever it may take, then the judgment changes. And indeed, when patients with this kind of brain damage encounter the footbridge case or cases like it, they're 2 to 5 times more likely than ordinary people to say that it's okay to harm one person in order to save several others. Manual mode, automatic settings, and again we see the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex lighting up when ordinary people say, let's go with the numbers. Now, what exactly are we responding to? Is this an emotional response that we want to trust, this emotional response that seems to be missing in these other people? Well, we can play around with these trolley dilemmas. So here's a trolley headed towards the 5, and here you are, and you can push this guy. Now he's got a big backpack, and save him. And most people say, as I said, that that should be down, not okay. 31% say that it's okay. No, I got it right. Never mind. 31% say it's okay. We can play with this. And now, instead of having the guy, you're pushing the guy there, we say, well, you can drop him through this trap door by hitting this switch, and that way you can save the 5. And when you give a separate group of people this kind of dilemma, most people say that it's okay. Something kind of funny going on. Perhaps our automatic settings are leading us astray. Let's go back to the Peter Singer problem of people on the other side of the world. This is research that Jay Musin, one of you, an undergraduate, did for his thesis, looking at what it is that makes us think we have an obligation to help desperate people. So we asked people, we give people a situation where we said, you're vacationing in this country that's been hit by a devastating typhoon. There are poor people badly in need of medicine and food, and you can help them by donating to the relief effort while you're there. Do you have a moral obligation to do this? And most people say that you have an obligation to make a substantial donation. And then we just modify the case a little bit. Now it's your friend who's traveling in this country, but he's telling you what's going on by filming it with his smartphone and letting you know all of the details of about what's taking place. You have the same information as you do here, you're just farther away. And now most people say that you don't have an obligation to help these other people. So what's going on in these cases? When we have the sense that we have a moral obligation to help the guy who's bleeding by the side of the road, that you'd be a moral monster if you didn't do that. But when it comes to saving the lives of people on the other side of the world, you're not a monster, you're just an ordinary person, maybe not a saint if you decide to spend your money on things like leather upholstery. Well, maybe that's a moral insight. Maybe we really have a deep moral obligation to help in the first case, and maybe not so much in the second case. On the other hand, Think about this from an evolutionary perspective. We evolved in a world in which there were people who were right in front of you who we could help, and who could help you perhaps sometime down the road. We did not evolve in a world in which there are strangers on the other side of the world whose lives we could save by making modest material sacrifices. And so perhaps it's a moral insight, but perhaps it's just our point-and-shoot morality. Perhaps it's just our automatic responses guiding our judgments, telling us you have an obligation here, but not here, and we're using our automatic settings when we're actually in a world for which those automatic settings were never designed. And so perhaps, while our moral emotions, our instincts, our gut reactions may get us the right answer most of the time, when we're dealing with complex modern problems of the kind that our ancestors never faced, from global warming to fighting an enemy on the other side of the world, when is it okay to bomb civilians, is it okay to harvest stem cells for medical research, and so on and so forth, it may be time for us to put our moral brains in manual mode and stop relying so much on point-and-shoot morality. Thanks.